Hi, I'm so excited to be here for Alaska Week. My name is Nicole Stellon O'Donnell, and I'm here to interview Annie Wenstrup today, but I want to start by thanking all the folks at Alaska Center for the Book for giving this space to talk about Annie's work. I'm really grateful for everything they put into Alaska Book Week 2025, and it's a great service to Alaskan literature. So thank you all at Center for the Book. So that said, as I said, I'm Nicole. I'm going to introduce you all to Annie Wenstrup, who some of you know, some of you are meeting. Annie is the author of the Museum of Unnatural Histories, which was published. When was the publication date, Annie? I've spaced that little part.
March earlier this year.
March 2025, and very shortly after it came out, Annie won the Whiting Award, which is a very major award and very exciting to have an Alaskan author win that. And so she lives in Fairbanks and she is from Anchorage. And I think we're going to start today with a reading from some of the poems of Annie's book, and she's going to share those on the screen so that you can read along as well.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And thank you, Center for the Book. I'm so happy to be here. I wanted to share a couple poems, as well as um, provide them visually to follow along. The book begins with with the table of contents, and part of the table of contents is a poem that runs throughout the length of the book, the event score for the curator. And it's an invitation into the museum space. Event score for the curator. Make the most of your time at the Museum of Unnatural Histories by following along with the event score. Carefully created and timed, the event score allows your body to mirror the curator's path through the museum exhibits. See what she sees, feel what she feels, dwell inside the problem of empathy. Alternatively, you may pause the tracks at any time. You may complete her work at your own pace. So one of the exhibits within the museum is an interview, um, and this is an excerpt from the interview. Excerpt: 25 years of tiny power. Tiny Architectural Digest interviews Polly Pocket at her home alongside the lazy river. Polly Pocket: that's a great question. Thanks so much for asking. My life now, it's like this. Solitude grits the inside of my clamshell. It never rains and it never shines. The lifeguard's chair sits empty. The riverbed remains dry. Sometimes I lie in bed and remember it wasn't always this way. I remember the girl that held me. She pinched me between thumb and forefinger, combed my feet in the depressions alongside the river. I pretend I remember what it was like to stand upright. I faced the lime green apple trees. Her face, her voice narrated my story. Together, we made the apples real. They ripened at her word. Transformed, we picnicked on them while watching the river. She told me it was our secret, told me the water's source was forbidden. The girl tweezered me into the river, and we pretended I floated through its S-curves. What no one understands, we always pretended she wasn't there. That was the magic. Tiny Architectural Digest. That sounds beautiful and lonely. Does it? It was never lonely. It was only lonely when we hosted parties and the other Pollies visited my clamshell. Their faces and bodies mirrored my own. She pinched us, turned us to face each other. We mimed saying hello while our bodies entered depressions. She told us what to say to each other. It was very polite. Tiny Architectural Digest. It sounds like you want to say it wasn't. Is that a question or a statement? I don't know if it was polite or not. I know it wasn't what I wanted it to be. When it was the two of us, I could ignore how her hands moved through my home. I ignored how her thumb and index finger gripped me. But at the parties, I saw how I must appear covered in fingerprints, unable to move myself. Seen this way, I knew the river was tap water. I knew we'd never eaten the apples, that they were only dots of red painted on green. So then here's another section of the event score. Track 3. Point to the gallery. Speak. Like this. The curator speaks to a docent. Here, she says, this is a gallery of mirrors. Very little explication is necessary. And then throughout the book, there are exhibits inside boxes. What does a hibernating wood frog look like? There is no muscle movement, no heartbeat, but still it is alive. Biological miracle from the National Park Service. And here's another exhibit poem from the book. The Parade at Remuda Ranch. The women walk through the door. The parade master does not, will not speak to us. Here is the show. Here are the women. We don't need to be told we're freaks. Why else would we be here? We run the gauntlet between forlorn trees, their bark weighted, their bark like a weighted glove. They mirror our bodies back to us. Bereft of mirrors, we rely on the naked trees to remind us of our forms. Like an obelisk perpendicular to red soil. We're paraded on. The door is ajar. It is ajar, like the one I kept fireflies in. No holes for air. The door is a bridge from one life to a hunger. The door lives in the distance of Daphne's footsteps between prayer and laurel. See her leading the parade. See her gilded leaves crowning our heads. Our eyes forward. We are marching. We remember Lot's wife. We've already salted our vegetables, assaulted our stomachs. The parade master keeps our time. Her baton, a carrot. Her carrot beats us forward. We are marching until our footsteps whittle us through another door. And so here's a return to the event score, as well as a diorama. Diorama D. Event score, track 6, for an incomplete incantation. The curator tidies her desk. She gathers the paperwork. Documents she should have archived, but can't bear to file or display. There's interpretive text for the diorama. This is the real office. The other is for show. No one wants to watch me file paperwork. And here is the last poem. A letter. For the family that purchased the home adjacent to the treatment facility. Dear neighbors, when you moved, did the realtor explain how the houses next door were staffed by an unkindness of professional believers? I imagine the realtor explained that the staff tries to save the living rooms partially full of girls. Did they say it's like what you see on telethons? Faithful servants, welcome or not, feeding the hungry? Good Christians try to save girls from their own hunger. I ask because I hope they also enumerated the virtues of the Blue Ribbon School, the nearby mall, all just beyond the gates. Did they tell you about the transformations you'll witness? Did they point to the branches of girls walking slow laps around the cul-de-sac? They're led by a woman speaking earnestly about the book of Luke. The woman knows the girls walk with a list of numbers where their stomachs used to be. She tries to feed them the bread of Christ, but I want to know how the girls affect your property values. It's hard to judge these things. usually living near the vulnerable tanks your appraisal, even factoring in tax breaks. But sometimes it pays to be near a girl. The neighbors are quiet, the lights are out at 10, no one brings home men. People pay a premium for proximity to silence. You'll only hear the girls at 9 a.m., mandatory chapel, hymns. Who doesn't smile to hear a girl sing? I'm running away with myself. I'd like to ask you what you saw. Were you living next door the night my roommate climbed onto the roof? She rebelled against the tyranny of Taco Tuesday. She sat on the roof while the sun set, a family pack of 12 soft tortillas the size of dinner plates beside her. She peeled beige circles apart. Her arm crossed her body. She flung her arm and the tortilla away. How they stuck to the yucca. Do you, like me, imagine another life? One where she was a disc golfer or a shot putter? Did you understand the tortilla was a second moon? Did you understand its strange gravity, how it compelled her arm, her heart? I ask because I want to know if it's different now. I'd like to see it different now. I'm lying to you. That's not what I want to know. I want to ask who still lives there and how did I leave? You're on mute, Nicole.
I'm muted. I'm so sorry. I had to mute. It was noisy here for a second. All right, I'm unmuted. Thank you, Annie. That was such a great selection that so shows the breadth of the structures in the book. And that was one of the big questions I have for you is about the structure of this book because there are so many layers within the structure. And I was thinking of it this way when I started thinking of it, and I'm going to use a couple poems just that you just read as an example. So people always say, a poem or a book, and I don't know who said it. If you know, email me because I looked before this interview, teaches the reader how to read it. But I think another way to explain that is something that I can cite. Tess Taylor often says that a poem, an important part of the poem is the way the poem stages itself for the reader so that the reader is put into a perspective to take the poem in, or the book in this case. And so I'm thinking about the ways you've structured this book. So we have this part, which is the one we're all used to and the one we're taught. You read a book from beginning to end, and there's pages, and you go this way. And then right away in the book, well, first you make it clear that this is a museum and not just a book. So we know that entering. And then we receive alternative paths. So you have the first part was the event score, which you've talked about. And I had gone through the book and read it in the regular way several times, and then read only the event score and read only the list of figures and looked at those in different ways. And it really changed my understanding of the book, especially seeing the curator as one solid piece that is broken throughout the book. Gave me a different view on the museum itself. So I'm really interested in your choice as you did that, as you structured the book. How did you choose to make those offerings to readers? And the way you've staged it, I guess, is the way what I'm interested in.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for such close reading. The event score for the curator was the last part of the book to fall into place, right? I knew early on what the conceit of the book was. Um, and I kind of felt like I lived inside the museum as I was building it, right? It was this very absorbing place for me. But
Mhm.
then when I spoke with Jim Schley, who was the copy editor, he he gave me some feedback about ways that we could build in signposting. The language for the event scores was in different sections of the book at the time. Um, and his feedback was that as somebody who hadn't been inside the museum for however long it took to work on, that the process of moving through and navigating that space was important for the reader, but they needed a way to orient themselves. And I was really resistant to that initially until we talked about ways that we could make sure that it kept a particular kind of voice, and then moving through it. And so it ended up being a really satisfying way to work on the project, and thinking about like, oh, here's this. I don't know, do poems have characters? This character who's really juggling with this question of agency, both within themselves, but also agency relative to the people who are going to be moving through the museum.
I appreciate that you use the word character because I feel like reading those together as one piece without the space between them. And I don't feel like it was a better way or has to be done even. But what it transformed was it transformed the curator into a character for me. And that was the word I was going to use. So I'm glad that you used it first because I think there are characters. Polly's definitely a character in here. Lady Diana is a character in here, and these other, and we'll talk more about those later. So I was thinking of those suggestions, those three suggestions. And then I also, your list of figures did a similar thing, and especially since there's a poem in there that's the lost and found, that's in the list of figures, right? And after reading the book multiple times, just either opening to a random poem or reading it all in a row, when I read the list of figures and came to the lost and found after my additional readings, I felt I felt like the threads were being pulled together in there in a way that if you hadn't suggested to me with those two alternate orders to go back and revisit the book, it really it really gave me a different perspective. And so I appreciated being challenged as a reader to look at a book again in ways that the writer points to. Because you said, try this way, try this way, try this way. For those poems, the ones, the event score, when your copy editor asked you to put them in, you said they existed in other places in the book. Were they not separated like they are entitled, or how did they exist? And did you have to write any new ones as you went through that process?
I did have to write new ones. Um, there was a series of poems about the curator that threaded through.
Mhm.
Um, it's hard. The book went through a lot of revisions, and I think um, part of the book structure, right, is it has chunks of information or poems situated in different areas of the page, right? Like I'm interested in both like the poem, but also the text around it. And so some of those navigational guides for the curator were appeared in footnotes or as marginalia. Um, and and they were really kind of secondary to if you think of like the main poem on the page as the primary text, they were subordinate to it. And I think that was really the big question I had when it was time to revise that structure in the book was what does that say if I make the curator and the curator's language as important as the exhibits themselves?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense when you say they had been subordinate, and so you had to go through the process of giving them their own space on the page that is equivalent to the space of some of the other poems, and giving us the map through them gives us another way to look at them again as a connected sequence. And I think that was really interesting. So, so I want to ask you this, and I'm glad the Polly Pockets interview is a poem that has always stood out to me in this book and all my readings. And so one thing I've noticed is, and then you also read two poems about Remuda Ranch, which comes from the section. I want to make it clear for people who haven't read the book. It comes from an exhibit called Performance Art. And so it those poems are part of a sequence that would be performance art inside this museum structure. So you have inside the structure like an interview with Polly Pockets. You have all these other figures appearing as characters. Chakotay, certainly from if I'm saying it right, from Star Trek, and he's a complicated character outside of your book and is complicated inside your book. And Princess Diana. And I was interested in um, characters, it seems like characters, and Polly's one of them, serve as proxies to discuss the body and discuss the self in the book. And there's many of them. As I reread and reread, I'm like, oh, I can see how this is also a way of approaching the self, and this is also a way of approaching the body. So I don't know if you want to start with Polly or talk about that a little bit, about how the body appears in the book. Certainly in the treatment center for eating disorders, the body is the issue, one of the issues, right? And so I was interested in how you developed that throughout the book and used different characters or different proxies for the body.
So I think that was the question of how does the body appear was maybe the largest preoccupation, especially at the outset of the book, in terms of, um, right, like when telling any kind of story about the body, there's a weird shift that happens, right, in objectification, right? It's no longer the story about, the person and their name, but how other people perceive them. Or how they perceive themselves. So there's a splitting that happens that denotes value. Um, and I I'd been really resistant to put any kind of narrative framework around that story, right? About the body, about eating disorders, because I didn't want to replicate that objectification, as well as I don't think that's the actual narrative, right? That by the time someone is ill, there's a whole narrative arc that led to that.
Mhm.
Um, and and I was interested maybe in unpacking how did this happen, right? I took a really fascinating class with Kate Marvin, I think in 2022, that looked at confessional poets and the pillars of white supremacy structure.
Mhm.
And it's based off of work done by Tima Okun. You can find it online. It's available as a free resource. But Okun's basic premise is that there are value systems that are aligned with whiteness, and to perpetuate white supremacy. And there's this beautiful illustration on the website that lists things like perfectionism, upholding the written word as like the ultimate authority, um, certain kinds of punctuality, different kinds of time telling. It's pretty exhaustive, but I looked at that list and I was kind of floored because I was like, oh, like, I've been in therapy and always those were my problems, right? The way that I relate to my body as a perfectionist in that therapy framework had been framed as an individual problem. But in Okun's framework, it was a value system that meant to uphold some people while oppressing other people. And I thought that's a much more interesting story to me. How does this work on a large scale? And maybe if I spend time with this, it will help me understand both how I move through the world as somebody who's Dena'ina and white, and why those value systems both hurt and harm me. And so the poems became a way of navigating that, and then the characters within the poems were really, where did I learn these values, right? Like, I'm really fascinated by the the news coverage of Princess Diana and Jean-Benet Ramsey's death, right? Like, I was an early elementary school student. Those are like core formative memories. And as a little kid, I knew that something sad had happened, but that wasn't really what I was drawn to, right? I was drawn to the spectacle and the fact that this woman and this girl were receiving a certain kind of attention, because they were beautiful and they in a very narrowly defined way. And I thought, like, oh, the way that, and as an adult, right, seeing that and seeing, I didn't know that Princess Diana was a humanitarian until I was an adult, right? What a loss to have that eclipsed. And so thinking about what other characters does that value system limit and eclipse, and writing about them as a way to interrogate how their bodies move through the world.
And I notice it with, I think of when I think of the poem about Princess Diana and your use of blue as an image that ties to blue eyes, ties to set, ties in all the meanings of the word blue that the connotations of blue that you cultivated and brought awareness to in the book. And then I think of Polly too, and that image of the little girl who learned about Diana and John Bonet, right? And is moving another little tiny girl through the world and controlling her in a certain way and scripting her interactions with other little tiny girls. And I felt like it went very deep in those layers of how did all that impact your perception of yourself at that age? So, and a question that just came to me as we're talking about this, in your museum voice, so often you say, you use the voice I think of as a museum that is geared towards, in some places, not in all of the museum exhibits, geared towards a young museum goer. Have you thought of this? Have you tried this? Like with a little question marker. Do you know about birds? That wasn't a quote from it, but I can't think of the one that was most recently hit me. And that then harkens back to you learning things about your body from an entire system that is defining it differently. Yeah. So, did you culture cultivate that voice in some places of speaking to almost a younger museum goer deliberately in those spots? I'm assuming so. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I like, right, most of those places occur in the dioramas.
Yeah.
Because I think that that's that's what we ask elementary school aged and middle school students to do a lot of, is to replicate the world around them and to point out what they notice.
Hmm.
And then there's a set of questions we ask about what they notice about what they're seeing, and they're meant to guide the student. And so it's it's the voice was there as both a way of noticing, but also just to break up the pattern within the book too, right? If you have these poems that are maybe more serious or that they're in a voice that's older, um, varying the tone is a nice way to give the reader a break or to
Hmm.
invite them to appreciate a different part of what the structure is trying to highlight.
Hmm. I think they came to the foreground for me as, especially as I did that reread of the two other alternate paths through the book, in the way the curator came to stand out, reading in the order let me get the right name, in the list of figures and reading through the dioramas at once, which I think is how that lost and found wound up standing out. Because in there you address Polly again with the lost mansion. And so I think that came together for me as a distinct voice in there. Do you feel like you were talking to your young self a little bit as well as your reader, or do you feel like that was directed at the reader?
Mhm. I think that the voice around the dioramas was always reader directed.
Mhm.
Um, I will say that like one of the processes of working with the dioramas was a chance of reframing childhood, right? Like what is it and paying more attention to those interactions, and seeing them differently, right? Like you interpret the world one way as a kid, and then you look at it again and you're like, oh, I missed something.
Well, it's
Yeah.
like what you said about the humanitarian side of Princess Diana. I didn't realize that at the time I saw it this way. Yeah. It's just so interesting to think about the way these sections highlight what you're doing with the structure when we read them in different orders. Um, so I also think there's formal proxies in the book that allow you to speak in different tones. One is the diorama and the cards that would explain what's going on. And I just listed a few out, but there's so many more. So there's sonnets, there's the interviews, there's a Lifetime movie script, which was a particular kind of script. There's performance art, there's a lost and found, there's an HR document. Um, how did you choose so many forms, and did that come easily, or was there a moment where you realized, oh, I've written a couple of these, I should try and move more into this? What led you to the different forms and that you have in the formal proxies for conversation or for address or for viewing and observation? And how did that work for you in process too?
I'm not a fan of generative writing. Like, I would
Mhm.
be happy to revise a poem for forever, but the first step of like, oh, writing the first shitty draft is miserable. Um, but what was nice about the museum as a conceit is it generates its own prompts, right?
Yeah.
And thinking about, well, how do I populate this? What are all the things that would be within a museum? And setting that as an assignment, it felt like play, right? I'm not making this very serious poem. I don't have to make something. I just need to inhabit this structure and see what kind of possibilities it offers. And that became, it's fun to do that.
Mhm.
And then seeing like, oh, at one point, like the sonnets came about because I was thinking about how one of the museums that I went to as I was writing the book had lots of small rooms instead of a large gallery space. And it was a really different experience to be in a small room while taking in art. And so I had thought, oh, all of the galleries will have these very small, intimate spaces as a way. And then, that didn't work for what the other poems needed to be, but it did work to create one wing of the museum. Um, the HR guide, the what was the other one? The lost and found list. I made a running list of things that the curator might have in their office and
Mhm.
thinking about um like have you ever done the poem prompt exercise where like the instructor makes you take something out of your purse and then it has to be representative of the self? It's like,
Mhm.
oh, okay, well, if she has these objects in her office, what does that mean about her, right? If you have the HR guide, like either you're a disciplinarian or a rule follower. Um,
Mhm.
right?
It's so interesting too because you bring up the objects from Office, and one that stood out to me on my rereading where I was looking at the curator in all in a row was her name tag and what it provides her access to and how it traps her because you used it both ways. So certainly a name tag you might swipe it and get out, but it also seems like it traps her. And I think the last time it's mentioned, if I'm not incorrect, and please correct me, is she folds it right into the shape of a heart. And I think that's in the last poem she's in. So, I hadn't really thought about you consciously going, what would a curator have? Yeah, they'd have a name tag, they'd have to wear it all the time. And, that's a really nice detail that kind of nice that it led you to play, because I think that's one of the things about the book that has made it so powerful is its ability to play and approach serious issues at the same time. And I think that was an interesting not it's just a real strength of the book. It gives us readers both at the same time. So, yeah.
I when I was working on it, like I whenever somebody talks about like the parts that are funny, I like to acknowledge my friend Lauren was we were at Story Knife together during when I was doing the first draft of this book. And I was like so dramatic, like, this is hard. This is sad. I don't want to write about things that are hard and sad and just like feeling very sorry for myself. And she asked me like what I was going to do um for the curator and the museum to make it a place they could inhabit, that nobody wanted to dwell in the place of unrelenting, crankiness. And and I was really mad at her, like, how dare you? I am suffering over here and you're telling me to lighten up. But then I wrote some poems thinking, like, well, I'm going to do a funny poem so that I can tell Lauren that it doesn't work. And then it did work. And I was really annoyed, like, oh, like, this is not fair. She was right. But it was such a gift to have somebody tell me that early on, and there are lots of ways she could have said it, right? Nobody wants to read something tonally flat. But instead, she made it this invitation to care for the curator and to care for the self that was writing it. And it ended up pointing me towards new kinds of structures to explore too.
Mhm. Do you how do you see the curator's role in relation to your role as the poet or the speaker? The curator is not the speaker in this book. But in what ways is the curator connected and or disconnected from the speaker? Because you have a lot of characters in the book, and the speaker in the poems is disconnected and connected to those. So I'm curious if we look at the curator as one of those characters who gets more time, right? She has a lot more time. How do you view her relationship to the speaker?
I think she offers a kind of distance to the questions that the speakers are trying to unpack, right? Like if each poem is really like one way of asking a question that can't be asked otherwise, um, that makes the world of the poem kind of, it doesn't leave room for other questions. But I think that the curator, um, right, they're the one who struggles with the agency. They're within this system, this institution, and they're both of it and they're critical of it. And they're trying to navigate what their responsibility to that place is. Um, why are they collecting these things? Do they have a choice in what they're collecting? And and so it like just on a practical level adds another layer of commentary. But I think too, um, it offers a way of maybe thinking about the book and like at one point I didn't think about the book as a series of poems, but as an essay, right? There's a question at the beginning, the middle unfolds it, and as the curator moves through the book, they're learning how to ask a different kind of question and think about it.
I had to jot that down, like the book of poems as an essay. And that made me think a lot of one thing we haven't talked a lot about right now. I'm checking our time. Um, Maybe just a little bit, and maybe this is where we find a point that we can come to a closure on. But so looking at the book as a book, like you begin with Sukdua and you end with Sukdua. So there is a weight, I think, for poets, and maybe you won't agree. Maybe you'll say, no, there's no weight whatsoever on your first and last poem in a manuscript, and we tend to get wrapped up in that, wrapped up in that a little bit. But I've heard you say that, well, often when people pick up a book, they don't read the first poem, they just grab. So, in the overarching structure of the book, framing it with those stories and those are another sequence in the book. How does that decision then frame the museum as well? Like how does that your decision in what we'd consider the traditional structure of a book, or that beginning, the intro and conclusion of your essay, I guess we'd call it.
Right? Man, I knew so firmly how to enter the museum space, and then I really was stuck, right? Like I had, this is the problem with the conceit, right? You have it and you have to execute the whole thing. Like you can't change it two-thirds of the way too, which is really a terrible problem to have. Um, and I had written, like many drafts of the manuscript, and that last third of the book became such a problem because you have to close out the museum.
Mhm.
And I didn't want the curator to be the way I was framing the problem is the curator needs to leave the museum. I feel very protective of them. I don't want them to be stuck there. But maybe I'm a little bit more antagonistic towards the reader, and I'm like, maybe you have to wrestle with these problems, and that's your job. And so I was going back and forth on what physical movement does the curator make to leave the museum, and how does the reader stay with the problem that can't be resolved? And the the way that my editor Susanna reframed it is, well, the museum isn't separate from the world. They overlap. They're intertwined. They're enmeshed, and sometimes you're in a museum space that museum space is also the world. And that gave me a lot of freedom in letting that question go, right? Of that feeling of like, oh, I have to tie this up. I need my poems to click shut. And so then I was able to look at it as um, patterns and patterning, right? I had a mentor, Catherine Larson, who told me that one of the most satisfying things about reading a poem or a collection of poems is to establish a pattern and either subvert or surprise it. And so thinking about what patterns are set up in the book and then how do they close out. And I had two sukduas. A third one seemed like it would add a nice bookend, while still um, containing the other elements that needed to be there.
So did you write that poem last to be the last poem? Or did that poem exist and it became the last poem?
Um, that poem existed in a lot of different formats. There's an intermission, I think it's halfway through the book, and we're in the parking lot three times,
Yes.
and and at first they were all one long parking lot poem. Um, and so a lot of the book, not just for the end of it, was a process of I had these chunks of language and of what the curator was experiencing or the speaker experiencing, and then just finding a way to set up a pattern where the reader would engage with those moments that was meaningful.
Mhm.
And so sometimes they appeared in long stretches. I tried chopping them into little bits, and then one of them ended up at the end.
I was thinking one thing I thought about a lot as, getting ready and rereading was that intermission poem because I actually listed in my list of potential proxies for the self and for the body was that tomato plant. Because it also serves that similar purpose, like looking at a being and how it grows and what it needs and what we do, what one does to give it what it needs. And so I thought that was another interesting pause in the book. Yeah, and you're right, the patterns do carry through. The ones you've overtly suggested in the beginning with the two alternate orders, and well, not orders, but the two paths you can take through the book. But you do have a lot of other patterns in there too to support the reader. Even though you said like maybe you were feeling antagonistic, you were very kind to offer the reader so many points of entry as well. Yeah. Um, how and do you imagine readers, do you have a way that you wish it would always be read, or do you want people to find the patterns they find?
I think now that I've like scripted a path through it, I'm like people can do what they want, right? Um, and and I hope there's enough with each individual poem that it's satisfying by itself. Um, One of the things that's hard about this book is it's difficult to excerpt from. It was hard to send poems out for publication in journals prior to the book coming out because um, each piece lends context to each other, or hopefully does. But I think too, I had so much fun with this idea of pursuing, well, what does it mean to spend time with Chakotay? And so if that's somebody's entry point in, like that makes me happy too.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
That's interesting what you said about it. It almost like the making of the path was what was important for you, and the way in which someone walks it is okay, is open then, is
Yeah.
open to all entries. So yeah, I really appreciate that. Let me think if I have any other um I had all you answered my questions so well, Annie. I wish I had some more. Is it? No, I don't think I have too many more. I think we've covered all the things, and I'm so appreciative of you taking the time to talk today and getting to talk through the structure, um, because it's wonderful. It's a wonderful place to walk through, as a reader in all the different ways you've built. So, yeah. So thank you.
Thank you, Nicole.